Everybody now has the distinct advantage of having a paper handout. We all like papyrus, as well as this digital handout, which you can't take home. But you can see, watch on the screen or on the paper as you will. And this reminds me that, okay. First of all, I'd like to say that we are honored today to have here the Vice President of Academic Affairs of this university, Professor Guy Meron. Thank you for coming. He's a professor, aside from his administrative role here, he's a distinguished professor of Central and Eastern European Jewish history, Holocaust studies, Israeli historiography, into all of which I think Herodotus would slip very, very well. We are more than delighted to host Professor Irene de Jong, professor of ancient Greek in the University of Amsterdam, as our keynote speaker in this year's conference of the Israel Society for the Promotion of Classical Studies. We feel fortunate that the weather, by which I mean the political weather, has cleared enough to enable her to come to Israel and participate in the conference here in Ra'anana. If this conference had been held even 3 weeks ago, I think Professor de Jong would not have been able to come. As we actually had a exchange about this, and why should anyone travel into a war zone to give an academic lecture, even if the lecture is on Herodotus, who we may guess under the circumstances, given his irrepressible curiosity, would have come himself. But we don't expect Herodotean scholars to come under dangerous circumstances. And, of course, one scholarly camp would say, well, he would just stay home and claim to have been here and made up all sorts of first-hand observations. But first of all, I don't subscribe to the lying school of Herodotus, and this is all speculation anyway. More importantly, Professor de Jong is now working on a narratological analysis of Herodotus, which will come out which will be brought out by Cambridge University Press, and I imagine that she will share some of the fruits of that labor with us today. This is only her latest application of narratology to a classical text. It is the latest in a long line of pioneering, and I should say often spellbinding, narratological analyses of classical texts. This began in the mid-1980s with her dissertation and her first published studies on narratology in Homer. In one of her first articles in 1985, even before she finished her dissertation, an article called Fokalisation und die Homerischen Gleichnisse. She felt the need not only to provide an explanation of what focalization means, but also give a brief history of narratology. For a while, in 1985, the theory and technique of narratology had been developing for about 20 years before, and actually the conceptual foundations were made long before that. But it was a new thing, I think, for most classicists in that year, 1985. Since then, she has instructed the world of scholarship, but also surprised and delighted us with, I would say, not a steady stream, but a rushing river of articles and books on narratology and other aspects of Greek literature, Homer, of course, but also Euripides, Sophocles, Herodotus, Apuleius, as well as books on more theoretical matters, which I particularly like, on space and time in narrative. Her distinction as a scholar has been recognized inter alia by memberships in national academies. Of course, in her homeland, the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences, but also the Norwegian Academy, the Academia Europea, and lately, just last year, the British Academy. Her topic today is beginnings in Herodotus' histories. B'vakasha.
Thank you very much, Professor Price, for this very kind and elaborate introduction. And let me start by expressing my gratitude to be invited as keynote speaker at this annual meeting of the Israel Society for the Promotion of Classical Studies. I consider it truly a great honor to give this lecture, which I also offer as an antidoron to Margaliet Finkelberg, who, as you all know, can't be here because her husband attracted COVID, but she did me the honor of presenting a lecture at the symposium organized at the moment of my retirement some 1.5 years ago. So my topic today is beginnings in Herodotus, and the point I will argue is that Herodotus shows a great interest in, indeed almost an obsession with, beginnings, an interest that he will turn out to share with both Homer and the scientists of his own time. So, as already anticipated by Professor Price, my paper today is a byproduct of the narratological commentary on Herodotus' histories, which I am working on for some 10 years now, and which I hope to finish this year. This commentary, by and large, follows the format of my earlier commentary on the Odyssey, and like a true narratological commentary, it focuses on aspects of narrative art. So the role of the narrator, time, space, characterization, perspective or focalization, and speech. For a discussion of the principles of a narratological commentary, I refer you to handout number 1. I may add, make a little bit advertisement that Brill is now launching a series on narratological commentary. So if anybody in the room would like to do this for a particular text, please come to me afterwards. My commentary on the histories, and this will be a little bit of a shock maybe for the historians in the room, my commentary on the histories refrains from discussing the historicity of the histories. That is, the reliability of Herodotus' account as measured against historical reality, about which we now, thanks to epigraphy, archaeology, etc., we know so much more. So it radically leaves aside the question of what is historical fact and what is invention, either that of Herodotus or of his informants. So the commentary principally adopts a suspension of disbelief and discusses and analyzes the entire story which Herodotus wants to tell us. The one historical aspect that I do include in my commentary is that of literary history. For Herodotus writes at a fascinating hinge point in Greek literature, the moment when written prose, next to poetry, emerges as a serious literary form. And I hasten to add, for one person in the audience, that, of course, prose did exist before Herodotus, but not maybe as a serious literary form. So it's the moment when both written prose emerges as a serious literary form and the moment when historiography takes over from epic and lyric the task of commemorating the past. In developing the new genre of written historiographical prose, Herodotus uses elements from all at that time existing genres. But of these genres, epic clearly is the most important one. That's why for me, as a Homerist, it's so nice to work on Herodotus because you recognize so much. So Homer is his main model, is the main model for Herodotus' conception of history. For instance, his focus on individuals. It's his model for large-scale structure and for a great number of narrative devices, such as speeches, hidden thoughts, analepses, flashbacks, prolapses, flash forwards, etc. And I give you a brief overview under number 2 on Herodotus and Homer, and you see one contribution here from someone in the audience. Through his adoption of the Homeric legacy, Herodotus aimed at endowing the new genre of prose historiography with the same authority as epic, an endeavor in which I think he has been exceptionally successful. So much by way of quick introduction to the larger context of my talk today. So let us now begin with the beginnings. As said, beginnings are all over the place in the histories, but there are two places where the topic of beginning is particularly prominent and is also debated. It's the beginning of the histories itself and the beginning of the Ionian Revolt, about halfway in the histories. Herodotus, like all narrators, sees himself faced with a double challenge at the start of the histories. He must capture the attention of his listeners or readers, and he must choose where to start his history. Starting a narrative means that a narrator somehow must get his narratees to stop thinking their own thoughts and instead devote their full attention to the narrative that he wants to tell them. A narrator must somehow seduce his narratees to cross a threshold from their own world into the story world and to become interested in that story world. And he must decide where to start, a choice which in the case of historiography is all the more difficult or radical, since unlike when one starts at the moment of the creation of the world, like the Hebrew Bible or like Ovid's Metamorphoses, a narrator must more or less artificially insert a caesura in what in principle is a continuous chain of events. Herodotus meets the double challenge with flying colors in his preface, because he both promises exciting content, a bit like the blurb on our present-day books, and carefully delineates his starting point, and that's your number 3 on the handout. His topic is things done by humans, more specifically great and marvelous achievements displayed by Greeks and barbarians. And the beginning of the narrative is the moment when these Greeks and barbarians started to war with one another. A polemeson is very much an ingressive aorist. I was trained in Amsterdam. We have lots of linguists, so you'll get some linguistics too today. So after this announcement, his narrative seamlessly and in epic fashion, that's to say via the repetition of a word, starts with the beginning of hostilities between Greeks and barbarians. For he ended his preface with, for which reason they started to war with one another, and then he starts the main narrative. Now, Persian historians say that the Phoenicians were responsible for the rift, where Aetius echoes Aetien, just as Eridi echoes Erisante in Iliad 1, and Ilioten echoes Troieten in Odyssey 9. So that's a very well-known epic technique. But this smooth transition actually is only apparent, since what follows is not Herodotus' view on who started, but the views of Persian and Phoenician historians. Number 5. Now, Persian historians say that the Phoenicians are responsible, Aetius, for the rift. For Phoenicians abduct Io, and this is the first of the injustices. Toon adikematon, proton, tutel, arxai. Then Greeks abduct Europa, the daughter of the king of Tyre, and the score is even. The Greeks then are responsible, Aetius again, for the second injustice when they abduct Medea, and the Trojan Paris feels free to retaliate by abducting Helen. Next, the Greeks are greatly culpable because they are the very first to launch a military attack against the Trojans before the Persians did so against Europe. Thus, the Persians conclude the destruction of Troy is the beginning of the hostility ten archen tes echtres between Persians and Greeks. The Phoenicians disagree, and then Herodotus refuses to choose, and he says that he will announce the one who he knows for sure to have been the very first to start injustice. Proton, hyparxanta, adikon, ergon, against the Greeks, namely Croesus. Much could be said about this, the whole structure. I'm not going to do it. I just focus on the issue, the very clear issue of beginning. It turns out that the question of who started is very much a matter of debate. It is a debate between historians, Persian and Phoenician historians, and Herodotus himself. But question of who started is not only a matter of academic debate. It is also very relevant for the historical agents themselves, since starting a war or starting hostilities also means that one is responsible for them. And this, in turn, means that the attacked party is justified in retaliating and avenging itself. So in number 4, we can see, the handout number 4, we can see that the, let's say, neutral and academic ITN reason changes into accusatory ITUs responsible. Beginning the histories with the rule of Croesus and devoting the first half of his first book to this Lydian ruler is a far from innocent move on the part of Herodotus. It confirms in the structure of the story that it was Croesus who began, that Croesus was the first to start hostilities against the Greeks. Indeed, the whole structure of the histories is ideologically loaded, in that the first 4 books recount the imperialism of the barbarians, the slow but steady subjection of the entire known world by 4 barbarian kings, Croesus and then the Persians Cyrus, Cambyses, and Darius. This imperialism only comes to a halt, so Herodotus' framing, when the Persians go against the mainland Greeks and are defeated at Marathon, Salamis, and Plataea, the subject of the last 4 books. The hinge point between the 2 parts of the histories is formed by the Ionian Revolt. The Ionians, that is, the Greeks living on the coast of Asia Minor, had been subjected by the Persians during the reign of Cyrus. But in 499 BC, they revolt against these Persian masters and managed to enlist the Athenians as their allies. Together, the Ionians and Athenians burn Sardis, but otherwise the revolt is unsuccessful. The burning of Sardis so much infuriates the Persian king Darius, however, that he swears to avenge himself, and this revenge then leads to the Persian expeditions against mainland Greece. It is here, in the context of the Ionian Revolt, that we find the second discourse on beginning, a discourse that has attracted less scholarly attention than the famous debate at the start of the histories, but I hope to show you that it's extraordinarily rich in associations and ramifications. Like in the beginning of the histories, we will see that historical agents too disagree about who started, and that Herodotus has a stake in the debate too. Ah, I know. Sorry, someone should have told me that I should have moved this. Okay, we're now nearing number 6. Okay, the start of the Ionian Revolt is marked by Herodotus no less than 3 times. And you have them here in number 6. So first he says, troubles began for the Ionians for the second time from Naxos and Miletus, ergeto kaka. Then troubles began for Ionia from these cities in the following way, ergeto kaka. The Athenians voted to send 20 ships to help the Ionians. Those ships became the beginning of troubles, arche kakon, for Greeks and barbarians. So the first 2 passages are found at the beginning, very beginning of the Ionian Revolt, when Aristagoras, the tyrant of Miletus, decides to help Naxian exiles to return to their country. Hence, Herodotus says in 28 that the beginning of troubles began from Miletus and Naxos, and he repeats the point in chapter 30. Aristagoras hits on the idea to involve the Persians, the Persian satrap Artaphernes in the enterprise against Naxos. But the entire expedition against Naxos becomes a failure, and then Aristagoras is afraid that he will get into trouble with the Persian satrap, and he changes strategy completely, and now he decides to revolt against Persia. He goes to Sparta and Athens to ask for help. Sparta refuses, but the Athenians let themselves be persuaded and send 20 ships. And this elicits the first instance of the Arche Kakon motif. Now, if you consult the commentaries, they will all give you the Homeric intertext for this Arche Kakon motif. And I give you the places here. They're well known. So there are two intertexts. The one is found in Iliad 5, where it is said that Tecton, the Trojan Tecton, who made these symmetrical ships for Paris, the ill-beginning ones, Arche-Kakus, that became an evil for all Trojans, like often Homer, as it were, explains his own word. So the Hai Pasi Kakon Genonto explains Arche-Kakus. And the second one is also a famous passage, the moment when Patroclus, I'll come back to it in more detail, leaves his tent, and the narrator says, and that was the beginning of evil for him, Kaku Arche. So commentators from the very beginning have seen the intertextuality, but they usually stop here. They leave it at that. They say CF, the notorious CF, which means take care of it yourself. Look at it and think what I mean. There's a very nice article by Roy Gibson on CF and on the laziness, laziness is maybe too unpleasant, but so the commentator says, okay, this is your homework for today. Anything. I think that more can be said about the how and why of this threefold use of the Arche Kakon motif, and in what follows, I will try to unpack all of its narrative functions, its ramifications, and associations. So, there we go. I start with the narrative function of the three instances of the beginning of troubles motif. In narratological terms, they function as prolepsis, or anticipations of events to come. Of the two Homeric intertexts, only the passage concerning Patroclus in Book 11 has the same proleptic function. Achilles has withdrawn from battle, which results in many Greeks getting killed or wounded. When Achilles sees this, he calls Patroclus, who leaves his tent, and the Homeric narrator marks this moment, and nothing is really dangerous at the moment, but he marks this moment by calling it the beginning of evil for Patroclus. For Achilles will send Patroclus to ask Nestor how things are going. Nestor will tell Patroclus that things are going very bad, and at the beginning of Book 16, Patroclus will come back to Achilles and beg to allow him to fight in his armor, which will lead to his death. So the Kaku Arche in Iliad 11 is a prolepsis of Patroclus' death, which will follow 5 books later. And here it may be relevant to quote or refer to a study by Klassen, which I only found out last week. That's the horror with Herodotus. The scholarship is so dispersed that you keep on missing things. And then when I was preparing for this, I hit upon this very nice article, which also happens to be published in your own journal, which is a nice coincidence. And he discusses Arche, not in Herodotus, but in Homer and Hesiod. And he says, and I didn't know about it, and I think it is completely right, he says Arche is never just the beginning, it's always a first point in the distant past which engenders a series of serious events. So it's always a chain of events which is followed and has consequences. And so it's a loaded term. And this very observation also holds true for Herodotus as well. The arche, as I will show, has an enormous chain of consequences. So the three instances of the arche kakon motif in the histories, so all of them in Book 5, are all proleptic, and they announce grave consequences. All three announce that the Ionian revolt will end in disaster and will bring the Ionians only misery, in that the Persians will harshly crush their revolt, and that is what you see in number 8. So at the end of the revolt, Herodotus writes, when the Persians had conquered the cities, so the Ionian cities, they chose the most beautiful boys and castrated them, making them eunuchs instead of men, and they also took the most attractive girls and sent them to the king. In addition, they burned the settlements, sanctuaries and all, and so the Ionians came to be enslaved for the third time. So these are the kaka for the Ionians. The proleptic span, as narratologists call it, of the third instance, the one in 597, is so the motif when it's used with the 20 Athenian ships, which became the beginning of troubles for Greeks and barbarians in chapter 97, is even, so the span is even larger, and it extends beyond the Ionian revolt. And this is, so I have it here again under number 9, and you can see that here more is involved. It has a larger, broader significance. You can see that by the use of Greeks and barbarians, which is an obvious echo of the proem of the preface, so I don't have to read it, you can see it at a glance. So here he is looking ahead to larger kaka. It's not only the kaka of the Ionian revolt, but now it's also the kaka of the Persian wars. So Darius and Xerxes' expeditions against mainland Greece. And Herodotus will again refer to troubles to come at a later moment in the text, at the moment when the Persian general Datis sets out for Greece, the first Persian expedition that will culminate in the Battle of Marathon. So the Datis' whole journey from Persia to Greece is described in great detail, and on his way he comes to the island of Delos, and then there is a major earthquake, and this is what Herodotus says about it. And a god showed this earthquake as an omen of the ills that were fated to come, ton melon ton kakon. For in the 3 generations of Darius, Xerxes, and Artaxerxes, more ills, kaka, befell Greece than in the 20 generations before Darius, some coming from the Persians, some from the leading Greek cities themselves, who fought a war over who would rule Greece, tes arches. So once more we hear about kaka, troubles, ills, that will befall. This time he only focuses on the Greeks during the expeditions of Darius and Xerxes. So this time Herodotus uses a religious register, talking about an omen, an teras, sent by a god, and using fatalistic mello. So mello is a verb that can indicate the future, but it always has already in Homer, but also in Herodotus, has a sort of undertone of what is fated by the gods. So here he announces, here it's again a prolepsis. It's in a religious register rather than the secular beginning of troubles in Book 5. But now the proleptic span is even larger. This is a very interesting passage much discussed, because now we not only hear about the Persian wars, so Salamis, Marathon, Plataea, but also the Peloponnesian War, the war between Athens and Sparta, which takes place during the reign of Artaxerxes. So this is one of the few places where Herodotus explicitly refers to his own present day, the situation of the war between Athens and Sparta. So much for the proleptic function of the beginning of troubles motif. The next question, of course, is to ask what is the effect, apart from it having a kind of structural function, as prolepsies normally have. We may also ask why, what does Herodotus, what is the emotion he wants to evoke by it? They announce troubles, ills, evils, of which the characters are unaware at the moment themselves, and thus it would seem that we are dealing with I would say, a pathetic emotion. They are supposed to engender pathos. And this is very clear in the Eleatic intertext, which I quote again, the intertext from about Patroclus. I just sketched you, and you all know the fate of Patroclus. So that is here announced for the first time. And if we would have missed the pathos of this first announcement, it will become very, very clear in another prolepsis at the start of book 16, when Patroclus actually asks Achilles to be allowed to fight in his armor. And then the narrator says, Homer says, thus he begged the great poor fool Meganepios, for indeed, Agar, it would turn out, a melon, there we have it again, that he begged for himself, hoi autoi, wretched death, thanaton kakon, and destruction. Now, the Homeric narrator usually is very restrained, but here he lights narratological fireworks. He calls Patroclus a poor fool, whereby Nepios expresses no criticism but sympathy. He uses an emotional combination of particles, agar. That is a combination which usually is only employed by characters in speech. He uses fatalistic mellow, and he uses a strong reflexive pronoun, hoi autoi, which is very strong, and which indicates that while Patroclus intends to help the Greeks, he will actually bring wretched death upon himself. So here it's very clear the tone could hardly be more pathetic. In the same vein, the Arge-Kakon motif in Herodotus 5 has, I think, a pathetic undertone. The Ionian revolt will end in disaster, as we already saw in handout 8, and as will also be clear from Herodotus' description of the capture of Miletus, number 12. The Persians, in the 6th year after the revolt of Aristagoras, take Miletus, Hyreusi, from top to bottom, Kat Acres, and they enslave the city population, thus making its disastrous fate, Topatos, fulfill the oracle concerning Miletus. He quotes an oracle. This is what happened to Miletus. Most of the men were killed, their women and children were reduced to slaves, and the temple at Didyma was plundered and burned. So here you can see that a bit like Homer, Herodotus is lighting some fireworks. He uses a historical present, Hyreusi, to mark this event. He uses the strongly emotional word pathos, which of course has this association with suffering, paschijn. And he uses the expression kat acres, which is another instance of Homeric intertextuality. The expression is only found here in the histories, and it is used 4 times in the Iliad and always in connection with the fall of Troy. I give you one, I quote one passage. Hector says, "We must join battle until either we kill them or they take a stake steep Troy from top to bottom, cut Acres, and slaughter its people." So Herodotus, in his description of the fall of Miletus, also notes that it took place in the 6th year after the revolt of Aristagoras. Also very interesting, because as you know, Thucydides, of course, always has this analytic method. Herodotus starts to use it in the second half of the histories, and this is one of the first instances. And such chronological calibrations, so they are rare, and its use here is very effective because he sort of connects the end and the beginning. That's more important, I think. Historians will focus on the 6th year and try to reckon when was this and when was that. As a narratologist, I focused on the effect of recalling at the moment of the end, the beginning. We once more, we are reminded that Aristagoras is the bad guy, is the one who started all this misery. At this point, I would like to make a small digression and note that Herodotus is not the only one to adopt the Homeric arche kakon motif. It's actually a widespread topos in both Greek and Latin literature, and I keep on collecting stamps. I keep on finding more instances, and I'll give you a small selection just by way of small moment of relaxation in my talk, and they are here. So just a random there, I think I've now some 50 instances. A famous one is Thucydides, where when the Athenians refuse a Spartan ambassador to address the assembly, the Spartan very threateningly says, "This day will be the beginning of great evils for the Greeks." So, of course, always a question, is he quoting Herodotus? Is he quoting Homer? Is he quoting all of them? Is it proverbial? All is possible. Then in Euripides, Troades, we have Helen speaking, who, of course, has to defend herself that she wasn't to blame, she's not the beginning. No, it was this woman, and she points at Hecuba, who gave birth to the beginning of our troubles, Argas ton Kakon, when she bore Paris. And a very nice one, and I've been discussing this one with Latinists because the Latin is a bit difficult, but a nice one is found in Aeneid 4, when the famous storm breaks out, and lo and behold, Dido and Aeneas happen to end up in the same cave. And what happens in the cave? That the narrator doesn't tell, but he says that day was the first step, was the first day towards Dido's death. And then the second primus is a bit funny. And, well, so I translate a bit stupidly, the first cause of her ills. So that's a very, very pathetic prolepsis. And there's even one in Flavius Josephus in the Jewish War, when, and I will pronounce the name funny to your ears, Eleazar, Dutch pronunciation, in Masada, is speaking about the Jewish revolt, and he says, after buoying us up with hopes, that only proved the beginning of greater disasters. Of course, Josephus, I take it, knew his Homer and Herodotus. Anyway, so even this small selection shows that it's all over the place. And if you want to find more, I give you two references of studies which I found, which have collected, and I found some more myself. And if you happen to know nice ones, please let me know. So this by way of small digression. Let us now return, because we haven't come to the end of it, to Herodotus' use of the beginning of troubles. and take a closer look at another aspect. As shown before in connection with the beginning of the histories and the debate about who started, beginnings always imply responsibility. And this aspect is clear in the other Homeric intertext for our Arche Kakon passage, and I give it once more in number 14, just to remind you, that's about Tecton, who made the symmetrical ships for Paris, the ill-beginning ones, Archikakus, that became an evil for all Trojans. Here, what happens here, narratologically spoken, is that the Homeric narrator looks back, not forward, but looks back and says and observes that Paris, by abducting Helen, started the Trojan War and thereby brought the ills for all Trojans. And the same point is made twice by characters. So Menelaus says to the Greeks, "You are suffering many ills, Kaka, because of my conflict and because of the beginning of that conflict by Paris." There's an alternative reading, Ates, but for the purposes of my paper, I prefer Arges. And Hector, who says at some point, "I will promise to give back Helen and all the goods that Paris brought to Troy on his hollow ships," which was the beginning of the war. So what is interesting here is that both Menelaus and Hector agree that it was Paris who began, who by abducting Helen caused the Trojan War. So for once, there's no debate, they both agree. In the same way, characters in the histories may look back and think, who started? Who was the beginning of the war with the Persians? And there are two possible candidates in the eyes of the Greeks. Either it was the Ionians and their revolt, or it were the Athenians who joined with their 20 ships in that revolt. So here too, we have characters who look back on Arche. The first is Themistocles, who at some time before Salamis tries to persuade the Ionians who are in the army of the Persians. He tries to persuade them to fight on the Greek side, and he, maybe it's not the best argument, it's not a nice argument, because he said, our enmity with the Persians found its beginning from you. So you'd better, you're guilty, so join our party. Didn't work. They, as Herodotus later says, only few Ionians fought badly at Salamis. But anyway, Themistocles clearly says, look, all this trouble we have on mainland Greece is all your fault because you Ionians started the revolt. Later on, after Salamis, when the Spartans fear that the Athenians will arrange for an agreement with the Persians, they say, it was you who stirred up this war by no desire of ours, and at the start, Argetan, it was your country that was at stake, and only now it involves the whole of Greece. So they refer to the 20 ships, and it's true that the Spartans didn't want to send ships. So it's, in a sense, it's true that the Athenians started and by these ships brought war to mainland Greece. Once more, we see, as in the beginning of the histories, that the question of beginning is disputed. The Athenians put it with the Ionians, the Spartans with the Athenians. For the Persians, of course, there is no doubt. They see the Athenians as the ones who started. Thus, Xerxes announces to the other Persian nobles his expedition against mainland Greece with the following words. I will not stop before I burn Athens, the city which started acting unjustly, hyp erxan adica poiantes, against me and my father. And he refers, of course, to the Athenians burning Sardis during the Ionian Revolt. And what, of course, is important, because the Athenians started, he feels he is entitled to retaliate and avenge himself. And the point will be made very explicitly by his general Mardonius, who says, "It would be a strange thing if we who have subdued the Sakai, Indians, Ethiopians, and Assyrians, who did us no wrong, would take no vengeance on the Greeks who started injustice, hypaxantes adikies." So when the enemy starts with injustice, you have the right to attack them in return. And the Romans, with their penchant for juridical thinking, will later formulate the famous justum bellum principle. That's your number 16. He says, Cicero says, "For only a war, bellum, waged for revenge or defense can actually be called just." So much for the historical agents' take on the beginning of the Ionian Revolt and hence the Persian Wars. They use the beginning as an argument and disagree about who started. But how about Herodotus? What is his view when looking back on the Arche Kakon in Book 5? It is clear that he does not buy the Persian argument that the Greeks started, and hence that the Persians are free to retaliate. No less than 4 times, he writes that their revenge only was a pretext, and that the real motive of the Persians was simple, banal imperialism. So there are 4 places where he says this. He says it the first time in Book 5, 102. This burning of Sardis, the Persians later made their pretext skeptomenoi for burning the temples of Greece. Second time, these cities, Athens and Eretria, were the ostensible target, proschema, of the Persian expedition, but their true intent was to subdue as many of the Greeks as they could. And he really brings it home, hammers it home to us. Darius desired to use this pretext, prophasios, namely the burning of Sardis, for subduing Greece. And then a last time, thus the king's expedition in name was aimed at Athens, but in truth it envisioned the whole of Greece. So it's clear that Herodotus thinks that the Persians abused the beginning of the Ionians by the Ionians and the Athenians for their own larger imperialistic goals. But does this leave the Ionians and Athenians scot-free? There is no doubt that Herodotus considers the Ionian Revolt an ill-advised enterprise. I'm not going to go into this, but there are many indications that he thought they shouldn't have done it. And hence, that he thinks that the Athenian decision to join that enterprise was also ill-advised. And this becomes clear from his caustic comment when Aristagoras has managed to persuade the Athenians to join the Ionians. Famous passage, 597.1, handout 18. It's really Herodotus at his most sarcastic. It seems to be easier to delude many than one. If Aristagoras was not able to delude Cleomenes, the Spartan, one single man, but with 30,000 Athenians, he could do this. Very interesting also Herodotus' take on democracy. He likes democracy, but he also clearly sees its weaknesses. Anyway, I think that Herodotus' use of the Arche Kakon, taken proleptically, is pathetic, but taken analeptically, there is this slightly critical undertone. And interestingly enough, This critical undertone was perceived by Plutarch. Plutarch is not always the best reader of Herodotus, but at least sometimes he's very sensitive to undertones. So still in your number 18, in Plutarch's The Malice of Herodotus, he says, Herodotus had the nerve, Tolmesas, to say that the ships which the Athenians sent to support the Ionians in the rebellion against the king were arche kakous, because they attempted to free so many fine Greek cities. He finds this a bad thing. So he criticizes Herodotus for criticizing the Athenians. But anyway, he has picked up on the possible critical undertone. Having discussed the proleptic and analeptic associations of the arche kakon motif, I have not exhausted its manifold meanings. There is a third aspect, and that concerns the clear Homeric association of the motif. This association, in and by itself, is significant too. As I said in my introduction, and as you all know, Homer is the most important literary model of Herodotus. By following Homer's model, Herodotus sought to elevate the new genre of historiographic prose to the same status as that of epic. But his Homeric intertextuality also has another rhetorical function. Through it, Herodotus suggests that his topic, the Persian Wars, is just as important and just as grand as Homer's Trojan War, the mother of all wars in antiquity. There are many places where this suggestive comparison between the Trojan War and the Persian Wars become tangible, and I pick out only one, again a famous passage to most of you, when Xerxes assembles the army with which he will go against mainland Greece. Herodotus says, handout 19, of all the armies we know of, this was the largest, and none could compete with it. Neither the army with which Darius attacked Scythia, and then we get, it's a kind of preamble, we get the whole list, and he ends, nor the army with which the Atreides attacked Troy. So here Herodotus clearly suggests that his war is even bigger than the Trojan War. And so when he uses an expression with clear Homeric associations, such as the arche kakon motif in connection with the Persian expedition, he clearly signals that the events which he recounts are comparable to, indeed, surpass the famous Trojan War, and of course, that he is a worthy successor of the great bard Homer. So much, that would be my third association of the motif. So much for the epic undertone. But as I announced at the start of my talk, there's also a contemporary ring to arche. Herodotus' interest in beginnings is shared by the Ionian scientists of his time, especially the medical ones. Herodotus' close affinity to the intellectual milieu of the natural scientists, the medical writers, and sophists of late 5th century Greece has been amply demonstrated in recent decades, and I give you an overview of some important, and the best, of course, is the study by Rosalind Thomas, who has collected almost all evidence. Now, all these scholars have collected a number of, let's say, technical terms which both groups, which Herodotus shares with the other Ionian scientists. So we have Aitie, Ananke, Apodeik, Atrekios, Diaita, Eikos, Elenchos, Historiae, Kairos, Martyrion, Opsis, Dicmerion. And so far, arche was not in the list of these people, but I think it should be added. For a doctor too, it's always interesting or relevant to know when did your pain start? What is the beginning? Because that may help to find out where it comes from. And if you look with TLG for arche, you find many, many places, and I give you 2 on the handout, which are very similar to what we find in Herodotus. So Hippocrates, or one of his pupils, writes, in general, you must investigate other diseases too in the same way, looking to see whence each takes its origin, ITN, investigating in this way and seizing upon the beginning, ten archen, of diseases, you will err least. I don't have to read the other one, it's clear, it's very similar. So I would suggest that Herodotus' interest in arche, in the beginnings, is also something that was in the air at the time he was living. And by way of the last brief part of my lecture, there's one more aspect of the arche kakon motif, which again links it to contemporary concerns. As you all know, the root arch not only means beginning, but also being first, rule. Thus, arche in the histories may also mean empire or hegemony. And this, for instance, is its meaning in number 10, which I repeat here under 23. That was as part of the Teras. He said, some kaka come from the leading Greek cities themselves, who fought a war over who would rule Greece, tes arches. So here arche cannot mean beginning, here it clearly is, who's the boss, who's the hegemon of Greece. And sometimes, and that's very nice, and very typical of Herodotus, who loves ambiguity or ambivalence, or how you want to call it, sometimes both beginning and rule are at play simultaneously. And that again is in the other passage on number 23, where when Herodotus says, so I know for sure who started its cruises, because prodetes kroisu arches, pantes Hellenes es an eleutroi. Before, so you would at first sight translate, before Croesus' reign, ruling, all Greeks were free. But if you read this after the 2 passages in which it was said that Croesus was the first to make Greeks pay tribute and the first to start injustice against the Greeks, then I think it's not far-fetched to hear this also. So you can also hear here, before Croesus beginning all these bad things, all the misery, all Greeks were free. So both can be heard at the same time. And Elizabeth Irwin, and you find the reference on the handout, she suggests that the similar ambiguity may be at play in our passage 597.3, the famous one about the ships, in the sense that I don't know exactly how she wants to translate it, that's not so easy, but she suggests that arche kakon could also mean an empire of evils, and then refer to the Delian League, of which Athens became leader in 454 BC, and which increasingly was felt by the allies to be an Athenian empire rather than a Greek alliance. Now there's one little point and then I'm finished. I note that mainly historians always want to read, even Chris Pelling, want to read Herodotus through Thucydides' eyes. Because Thucydides speaks of arche, of the empire of the Athenians, and they keep on finding all kind of references to this later situation, and I'm always a bit hesitant to see it everywhere. So in my commentary, I mention the suggestion of Irwin, but with some hedging. I'm not sure whether everybody would already hear this when reading this, but it's an interesting suggestion. So, with this last teasing out of all the implications of the deceptively simple phrase arche kakon, I have come to the end of my paper. I hope to have given you a taste of my narratological commentary, especially of the way if you look at certain things with narratological spectacles and start thinking, oh, this is a prolepsis, this is an analepsis, what does it mean? It's like the Ariadne's thread, you keep on finding things, and then the problem is how to put them in your commentary, but that's my problem. So I hope I have given you a taste, and I also hope to have given you an idea, which is my main purpose actually in writing this commentary, is to pay tribute to Herodotus' narrative art. And I don't have the idea that what I do can help historians to find out wie es eigentlich gewesen, but because nobody will be able to, but so that's not my purpose, but maybe for some of them it can be relevant to see how you can read Herodotus and what you can do with it. But my main purpose is to pay tribute to his fantastic narrative art. Thank you very much.